Hey everyone, I'm going to go over Chapter 11, Neurosis and Mental Illness. This chapter is very interesting because it starts to tie all the things together. It starts to tie all of the contingencies that we have used with avoidance and escape for us to avoid coercion. With all of that, we start developing coping mechanisms. And if we use these coping mechanisms to an extent and too far, they can affect how we function in everyday life. First, the book talks about how neurosis and mental illness is called sick behavior. But it's not always just related to coercion. We have to think about the person's history, their environment, or any other factors that could take into play that has led them to use these coping mechanisms. This is when we want to look for how coercion may have affected them. We want to look at the previous avoidance, contingencies, and the shocks. This will be able to help us better treat the person if it is an illness, help us to be able to treat them better. I'm going to go over the coping mechanisms that Sidman talks about in this chapter. The first one he talks about are phobias. We all may have a phobia, like a phobia of heights, a phobia of crowds, a phobia of clowns. We may not know why we are afraid of these things, but whatever we do, we try to avoid them at all cost. For example, if there's a crowd, a person may try to take the longest route to avoid getting even near a crowd. I know for a clown or like a person in a costume, I will do whatever it takes to avoid coming in contact with that individual. So myself, do take unnecessary steps to avoid coming in contact with something that may cause me fear. As I said, this may or may not have been caused by a previous shock or experience. We may not be able to understand why we have this phobia, but we do, and this is just one of the beginning of the coping mechanisms. And with phobias, they try to use systematic desensitization. So this process helps us to reverse the phobia. The book gave the example of a crowd. They would start the person far away from the crowd so they could see the crowd. And once that became less aversive, they would move the person closer and closer to the crowd. That way, once they were able to get back in the crowd, they were able to come over that phobia. The next coping mechanism is reaction formation. This is based on impulses that may produce a negative or positive consequence. It may not matter which one, or it may cause both. No matter which one is chosen, a shock will occur to cause that consequence. We react to the shock based on a prior avoidance from a past experience. The next defense mechanism that Sidman talks about is sublimation. This is where we are channeling our defense mechanisms to hopefully do a more appropriate behavior than the behavior that we would normally go to. Given an example of an artist, they use art to avoid being punished for how they are feeling, how they are expressing their impulses, such as sexuality, depression, fear, anything in the form of art. By using it in the form of art, it becomes more acceptable. So they are avoiding the punishment they may receive if they express it in any other way besides art. The next one is projection. This is when we try to avoid our own self and not be really fully aware of our self-awareness. I figured a good example would be like a political campaign. When a politician is running, he projects maybe his bad influence, his bad contingencies, his bad behavior, his bad self-awareness onto that opponent. The way he looks better, the way he has a heads up in the game. So voters will more likely vote for him, not see his trouble or his inappropriate behavior, and will see the disapproval in the other candidate. The next one is displacement. This is when we are channeling our behavior onto something or someone that may not be able to react back. This causes the initial shock to be hidden and hard to recognize when we are looking at this coping mechanism. The book talks about a child who does not like their newer sibling, and since they can't get rid of that newer sibling, they take their frustration out on a dog or another object. So they're now putting a behavior that's appropriate to them, so they're not getting in trouble hitting their sister. So they no longer hit their sister, but now they hit the dog. But the family doesn't recognize that they're just displacing their behavior as a coping mechanism because that individual doesn't want that little sister around. Next is regression. This is when we go back to a previous state of behavior that has helped us to avoid punishment in the past. We regress to using escape behaviors to avoid the task or to get attention from others. The next one is obsessions and compulsions. This is when we repeat behaviors to avoid the task we are needing to complete. It talks about in the book about becoming automated, and I believe in a previous discussion we talked about how individuals start to become automated like robots. They just keep doing that repetitive behavior to get out of doing whatever it is they are trying to avoid or escape. Use of compulsion is a way to use self-control and to control your own behavior. An example was of a lady who obsessively washed her hands. Why was she doing this? What was she trying to avoid? Was she trying to avoid germs, interacting with her family, cleaning up the house, just every regular task that she was trying to avoid? Well, to help figure this out, we need to try to figure out, does she have a previous shock in her history to enhance this defense mechanism? If we know why she is obsessively doing these behaviors, we may be able to help this compulsion and help get her fixed. Next is conversion disorders, and they talk about hypochondria. We all know as a kid we used to make ourselves sick to avoid going to school, or get out of doing homework, or try to not do chores. So hypochondria is just a way of teaching ourselves how to avoid situations that are aversive to us. We're not necessarily faking it. We are creating avoidance and escape behaviors just to avoid a task. The next one is amnesia. This is when we are trying to lose our memory from certain shocks that have occurred in an environment that may have been very punishing. They call it being behaviorally disabled, selecting what we want to remember. Defensive amnesia is the fight or flight mechanism when a person detaches from a certain environment. And this is said to place a person in a fugue state to escape the environment they are in. This can happen for a brief amount of time or a long amount of time, or maybe just long enough for the person to start a new life, to avoid or escape their previous life, and then return back to what they previously avoided or escaped. and then being welcomed back and getting that reinforcement of being back into that environment. The last one is being multiple personalities. I found this one very interesting in how they described it. It's about how we divide ourselves into multiple states. When we become super stressed in one of our behavioral states, we learn to shut it down and create a new one. Then once that one becomes too much, we shut it down and create a new one, and we repeat this as much as we need to. So when one state of behavior becomes too much, we just turn it off, switch another one on. And I found that very interesting on how they described that, because I never had really thought of it being described that way. And then they finished the chapter off about being what's abnormal and normal in mental illness. I guess we just need to figure out what we consider what, so we are able to effectively help individuals with these coping mechanisms that have led them to use these to avoid an escape and to avoid coercion. And my question is, if you could pick one defense mechanism from this chapter and provide examples of how we could use positive reinforcement to help the individual who had decided to use this coping mechanism. Thanks, everybody.